Hello, my name is Phyllis Rappaport, Chair of Boston's Rappaport Foundation, which supports emerging leaders in the fields of state and local public policy, medical research, education, and the arts. You may visit our website at rappaportfoundation.org to learn more. Thank you for joining today's discussion. The future is female, empowering women to run for office. In 2020, more women, particularly women of color, ran for office than ever before. Historic wins across political affiliations spanned from state legislatures to the halls of Congress and the White House with the landmark election of Vice President Kamala Harris. But even with these strides, women are far from reaching gender parity. Women make up less than a quarter of the US Senate, less than a third of the House and statewide offices, and hold 12 governor seats out of 50. The good news is that when women do run, they are just as likely to win as men. The bad news is women are less likely than men to be recruited to run for office. So how do we change this paradigm at such a critical juncture when women's healthcare and reproductive freedoms remain under assault? We've assembled a team of experts and elected officials to dissect this topic. And we're fortunate to have Jessie Mermell lead this discussion. Jessie is president and founder of deWitt Impact Group and a leading progressive voice with over 20 years experience fighting for equity and social justice. She's been on the front lines of winning campaigns, including equal pay, paid family and medical leave, increases in minimum wage, and reproductive health care. She implemented progressive strategy at the Alliance for Business Leadership, a socially responsible business organization, as communications director for Deval Patrick, and as Communications and Government Affairs Manager for Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts. Jessie is former state director of the Massachusetts Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired. She was executive director of Fair Test and the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus. For over a decade, she's been featured as a political analyst for NECN and WGBH. In 2020, Jessie was a Democratic candidate for Congress in the Massachusetts 4th Congressional District. She was elected to the Brookline Board of Selectmen in 2007, serving until 2013. Upon her election, she became the youngest selectman in the history of Brookline and created a female majority on the board for the first time since the town's founding in 1705. Jessie, thank you so much for leading today's discussion. I hand it over to you.
Phyllis, thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much to the entire Rappaport Foundation team for hosting us and hosting this incredibly important and timely conversation. Phyllis, I laugh when you talk about me creating the youngest, being the youngest voice on the Brookline board. That was many years ago and certainly would not be true were I to be elected today, but I was delighted to be in that position in what feels like the Jurassic period. Like I said, we have an incredibly important and quite possibly not more timely conversation we can have today about getting more women to run for office, something that we have always needed, but need now more than ever. And as Phyllis mentioned, the Rappaport Foundation has brought together an incredible panel of talented women who know this work inside and out. They have lived it, they have led on it, and we are honored to learn and hear from them today. I will do quick introductions because we want to get to the meat of the matter here. In alphabetical order, we are joined by Amanda Hunter, who leads the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, working to increase women's representation and equality in government. Amanda has been at a host of roles at the Barbara Lee Family Foundation before leading it over the past several years. If her face looks familiar to you, it is because you have probably seen her on CNN. Let's see, where else? You've been in the New York Times, you've been in Politico, you've been in countless local TV stations. So Amanda is a very, very familiar face and expert in this field, and we are delighted to have her today. Mayor Kim Janey is the president and CEO of Economic Mobility Pathways, helping families living in poverty. And she is also the first woman and first Black person to serve as mayor of the city of Boston. She is living, breathing history and has lived this from a host of angles that are incredibly important to our conversation today. Mayor, thank you so much for joining us. And we also have, last but certainly not least, Representative Tram Nguyen, who is the state representative representing parts of Andover, North Andover, Boxford, and Tewksbury. She was elected in 2018. She is first generation Vietnamese American, the first person in her family to graduate from college and law school, and the first Vietnamese American woman to hold elected office in Massachusetts. We just have a panel of history makers with us today, and it's incredibly special. Amanda, Mayor, Representative, thank you for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us today. So I want to jump into things. Mayor, I'll start with you, and then maybe we can go on to the representative. And Amanda, I'm going to ask you to bring up the rear with the research side of things. For the mayor and the representative, why did you first run for office? What got you over the hurdle to say, I'm throwing my own hat in the ring? And what was that first office you ran for? And Amanda, when we get to you, what does your research and your experience working to recruit candidates show about why folks make that turn? So Mayor Janey, what did it for you?
You know, it just got to a point. Well, first, let me say thank you. I want to thank this amazing superstar panel. I'm grateful to share the stage with you. And I want to thank you, Jesse, for your skills as a moderator, and certainly to the Rappaport Institution. This is a very timely topic. For me personally, I ran because it just got to the point where it felt that was the only other option. You know, Angela Davis has this quote that talks about when she could no longer accept the things that she couldn't change, she's going to change the things that she can't accept. And I think I had gotten into that point. And so for me, it was just time. Now, this was for me something that people around me had been encouraging for 20 years. And I'm sure Amanda can speak to this. There's a stat that it takes several times being asked for a woman to finally say no. I think that stat is 7. For me, it was probably closer to 70. But I had reached that tipping point where I knew it was time for me to roll up my sleeves and put my hat in the ring in that way. I had been doing great work on the outside and wanted to have a greater impact by changing policies on the inside. But it just got to a point where I could no longer, you know, I wasn't sitting on the sidelines, so I can't say that, but where I just needed to jump in so I could have a greater impact.
And share with us what the first office you ran for was.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry for folks out there who may not know. I ran for Boston City Council District 7. This was back in 2017. It was a very crowded field of talented candidates. There were 13 of us running for one seat. And to put that into context, the Boston City Council has 13 members. So there were 13 people running for this one District 7 seat. And I was successful in that race, and I'm grateful for every woman who decides to jump in and run for office.
Wonderful, thank you. And Representative, before I get to you, I will say to our audience, I've encouraged our panelists to jump in and share observations, to build on what each other is saying, to ask each other questions. I can assure you it is not a shy group. So I offer that as an explanation to our audience, and also as a reminder to our panelists, please feel free to build on what your colleagues are saying. So Representative, what did it for you?
Oh, first of all, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be on this panel with all of you. And as a Rappaport Institute Urban Fellow, Urban Scholar, I'm just so thrilled to be a part of this panel. And I'm glad to hear the mayor's answer, because it was very similar to mine. I think all of us felt a little bit of that push after 2016, that even though we were involved before that, we wanted to really make a difference, because we saw that our country and our democracy was at stake. And that was the impetus for me. At the time, I was an attorney with Greater Boston Legal Services, helping survivors of domestic violence, seniors, veterans, new immigrants, low-wage workers, et cetera. And in doing that work, I saw the power of policy. So not only did I represent them in the courtroom, but I saw just how good policy could help people, and how bad policy, or even a lack of policy, because, you know, these people are not even considered, how that could truly hurt them. And so I started working on legislation that you might have heard about. I'm sure you all know about family medical leave, increasing the earned income tax credit, making sure that we have bilingual education. And in doing that work, that advocacy work, I reached out to my representative, and for 2 years, he never reached out to me, never got back to me. And I find that to be very problematic, because to truly represent the people, you need to understand the people. Even if you disagree with them, it is important to hear the other side so that you can make an informed decision. And so I found that to be very frustrating, to have a representative who was not willing to even engage in conversation. And so I started looking into his record, and frankly, I was stunned to see some of the things that he was proposing, one of which was to allow police officers to stop anyone who looks illegal, basically wanted to legalize racial profiling. And as an attorney, as a woman of color, as someone who's worked with very vulnerable populations, I saw just how terrible that would be if we continue to have someone like that representing us in office. And so I decided to, that was my first race. That was my very first race ever, to run for a state representative, to represent this community now. And that has been my focus since I've been in office, is to be accessible and available to the people, but also to build power, to build on civic engagement, to get more people to pay attention. Because what I found during that time was, or what I found to be most frustrating, was I couldn't believe he represented me for 6 years, and I had no idea, because I was living here, commuting into Boston to work. And it was just one of those things where I told myself that I don't want people to feel that disconnected to government, because government is supposed to work for the people. And that was why I decided to run for office. And that quote about, you know, being asked 7 times, yes, I remember people, when they found out that he was my rep, asked me over and over. And it took me a very long time to come to that decision. And frankly, I think that we are lucky, Mayor, that we were even asked, because I don't think most women of color even have that privilege of being asked to run. And so I'm very intentional now of going to these spaces to remind particularly women and women of color that you should run, you should consider it, you should reach out. And there are, of course, are still hurdles and barriers for us to work through, but we're slowly making progress. And I'm excited to see what else is, what else is to come. And with the help of the Barbara Lee Foundation, the Rappaport Institute, and so many other organizations, I think we can make good strides.
Fantastic. And we're going to get to those barriers in just a moment. But Amanda, is what you just heard something that tracks with your research and your experience in the trenches?
Well, this all definitely tracks, and also just have to echo everyone else on this panel that we're so grateful to be included. And thank you to Phyllis and Sean and everyone at the Rappaport Foundation. And it's a privilege to be with all of you here today. I think that both the mayor and Representative Nguyen's stories really mirror what we've seen, especially post 2016, that when my boss Barbara Lee started this work 25 years ago, women may have been less likely to step up and run. And also there were a lot more structural barriers with internal politics and party politics, where women were told to wait their turn or work their way up, get more experience. Barbara always says that women don't run for office to seek fame and fortune. They run for office to solve problems. And I think that both the mayor and Representative Nguyen are examples of that they were doing really important work in the community, recognized problems that needed to be solved, and then stepped up to run. And I think one of the most exciting things that we've seen since 2016 is that women are no longer waiting their turn. They're not listening, get more experience, wait a couple of years, and they're running and winning, because I think that women are feeling such a sense of urgency of all of the problems that are affecting their communities and their families. And voters are really responding to women who may not have been groomed for a lifetime of politics on the ballot.
Well, let's get to some of the tougher stuff, right? So Representative, you referenced what some of these barriers are, and we know that there are different barriers for different women. If they're women of color, our colleagues and siblings in the LGBTQ+ community, this is not a uniform situation. But talk to us a little bit about barriers. And I also want to prompt you, because I know there's legislation in the building around addressing one of those barriers, particularly around the cost of childcare. Could you share your own experience, but also educate us on what is possible with some policy change?
Absolutely. I think this is such an important discussion to have about what the solutions. I think that that's what I'm interested in. But in talking about some of the barriers, of course, I do agree that in previous years, there might be other structural barriers of people telling women that they're not ready. But I think women typically, we want to be overqualified before we run. And I feel like that is an additional barrier that we're putting on ourselves. And we need to help support one another in feeling that confidence to run, right? And just like we were talking about earlier about being asked several times, I needed to get all my ducks lined up in a row before I could even make that yes, like to say yes. And I don't think men do that. They wake up and they're like, I'm going to run for president, whether or not they're qualified. And actually, I'm taking a class right now, behavioral science, diversity, equity, and inclusion class, where this is shown across the board, not just in politics, in any position. Women apply for promotions less often because they feel like they need to have like 70, 80, 90% of all the qualifications before they would even apply. Whereas, typically men would see 20, 30% and say, I'm enough. And so I think that's one thing that we need to talk about and think about. And also, women tend to start their political careers in local office and representative government rather than taking on bigger positions. And I love to hear that women are not waiting their turn anymore. And I'm starting to see that trend of that changing as well. But that's also one of the things that we need to consider. And of course, women just have a lot more family responsibilities. And this goes to what Jesse was talking about earlier. We do have a bill in terms of childcare, for instance. Why is it that we can use campaign funds to pay for personal expenses and things like printing literature, meals for campaigns, even a tuxedo, but we're not able to use those funds to pay for childcare and this would benefit not just women, all parents, right? To allow them to run for office and to allow them to balance having a family and a career. And so I'm really excited for the bill for this year, which is an act supporting parents running for office. It is H669. And this would eliminate that major barrier for parents seeking public office and advancing equitable political representation throughout the Commonwealth by allowing women, men, parents to be able to pay to have their children looked after. And I have heard many stories of candidates where they're like, we have to have a whole network of people, hodgepodge type of network where, you can watch my kid here and there. And I don't think that is sustainable, right? And so I'm thrilled that this bill is a priority of the Women's Caucus as well as several other caucuses. We're excited to continue to push this forward and allow to build on that political network, volunteer base, and hopefully increase representation for women. We're in the legislature. We finally passed the 30% mark, and we hope to continue to build on that.
Great. And to clarify, oh, I'm sorry, Merrick, please go ahead.
I was just going to jump in because the representative was spot on in highlighting what some of those barriers are. And I'm so glad to see the legislature addressing some of that with this bill around childcare. Another major barrier for women is money. And I'm not talking about the ability to raise campaign funds. And there might be some disadvantage there if you're not, tapped into these networks that are used to giving to candidates running for office. I'm not talking about raising the money. I think many of us have demonstrated we can raise the money. I'm talking about our household expenses. So for me personally, I'm a woman of color, Black woman. I am the head of my household. There's one income in my house. To run an effective campaign, it is very difficult to do a full-time job. And for women, most of our jobs are more than full-time. Representative Nguyen talked about the family responsibilities at home falling more to women. But as the head of my household with one income, if I stop working so that I can run for office, who's going to pay my bills? And so there is this need for us to have some money, some bank, so that we can take that time that we need to pause our responsibilities in our 9-to-5 day jobs to run for office. If you're not able to kind of just take that time, it's going to be a really difficult uphill run for you. So I just wanted to highlight that, but the good news is that there is a bill that's going to help with some of this, and that there is growth. So congratulations on reaching that 30% mark as well.
And Mayor, I'm so glad you made that point. Important clarification that would impact running for state or local office. There's already a federal law that allows federal candidates to pull a salary and also to pay for childcare. But there's a lot of stigma around doing that. And so some candidates, even though you have the option, don't do it. I see there's some stuff happening in the chat here. If you do have questions, we're going to get to them at the end. You can drop them in the chat and we'll be moderating that. So thank you to folks who are asking questions. Amanda, I'd love your thoughts on how the research and how your own experience bears all of this out.
Well, I think everything that Mayor Janey and Representative Nguyen have said have been spot on in terms of some of the structural barriers that women face when they run for office. We often talk at the foundation about a larger barrier that we call the imagination barrier. And both Mayor Janey and Representative Nguyen are both barrier breakers in the offices that they held and the elections that they won. And we know from our research that when women are the first to hold an office, oftentimes voters simply can't picture a woman in the job because they've never seen it before. And so even having more women run, seeing more women on the debate stage out campaigning, it literally shows people a different picture of what leadership looks like. And we often tell ourselves that when this next generation of children grow up, they're never going to remember a time that there were not more women and people of color and LGBTQ people running for office, getting elected to office. And that's where I think we will see major change in voter perception. But on the children and salary front, I think it's really interesting because women just typically in households that have children tend to be far more responsible for childcare. So this does affect everyone that has children in their family, but women are 15 times more likely to be responsible for childcare in their homes. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, in the United States, 85% of women become mothers by the time they're 45 years old. And last year, only 4% of our Massachusetts state legislature were mothers of children under 18. And so when you think about all of the things, especially post-COVID, that are affecting families in Massachusetts and decisions that have to be made, there are very few people elected last year at our state level that had an actual stake in those problems. And I think that is a reflection of those structural challenges that we're all talking about.
So let's get into a little bit of the nitty gritty here. I'm an audience member. I'm watching the three of you. My wheels are turning and I'm thinking, I might want to give this a shot. What are the skills that I need for anybody, but particularly for a woman who's thinking about running for office? And Amanda, I want to start with you.
Well, I think that's something that Representative Nguyen said really resonated with me when she said that you almost need to be overqualified when you run for office. And so much of that is because voters still hold women to a different and higher standard. A lot of reasons because of the imagination barrier. And anybody that is not straight, white, or male, when you change any of those categories, you see more of an uphill battle in convincing voters that you are qualified. And women face an additional barrier that not only do they have to show that they are qualified, they have to be likable, because voters will not vote for a woman if they don't like her, even if they think she's qualified, but they will vote for men. And maybe some of you can think of some men that maybe they say they don't like or are mean, but they think are effective leaders. So that is just a burden that women have to face that men don't. And women have to be specific. Men are able to simply release their resume, and that's taken for granted. Oh, he ran his own business. Oh, he held this job. But for women, they actually have to show, oh, okay, she held this job, but what did she actually do? Was she able to balance a budget? Can she manage employees? So women have the burden of having to constantly communicate and reiterate their accomplishments and work much harder to prove economic credentials. Voters tend to just assume that women are not good on budgets and the economy. So women are really, when they run for office, doing what people said about Ginger Rogers when they say that she danced backwards and in heels when Fred Astaire gets all the credit. It's very similar when you look at all of the hidden burdens that women face when they run for office. And I don't know if either of you faced any of those barriers when you were campaigning.
Mayor, anything like that come up for you or other things?
I mean, those were, you know, things that I would have suggested as well. I think there, for me, you know, my first race was very unique in that it was a history-making race. This was the first time we had 6 women elected to the Boston City Council. The Boston City Council now is majority women, but at that time, the largest number was 4. The seat that I won prior to me winning the race had always been held by men. And so I had another burden to overcome, which were cries from the community that there wouldn't be any Black men on the Boston City Council, and that the men running in my race needed to win and people needed to support them, because if they support me, somehow I was responsible for the fact that there wouldn't be any Black men on the council. So that was one burden. But the one thing that Amanda said too that resonated with me was around the qualifications and having to reiterate your resume and all of the work that you have done. When we do that, we have another barrier and burden, is that we are bragging and that we are boastful and that we're not humble enough. And so it's like a lose-lose. If you say and explain and talk about your work, you're being boastful. If you don't, what have you really done? And so it's really that catch-22. And it's part, you know, connected to the larger society around misogyny and just kind of a toxic culture that does not appreciate all that women bring to the table. When we talk about budgets, lots of budgets are managed by women, if not in the workplace, certainly in the home. And so we have these skills as communicators, as, you know, able to manage money, able to run your household or your workplace, but yet there are still these questions around your qualifications.
Absolutely. I cannot agree with you
I wonder
more.
if we should put all the ingredients without the
That
mayonnaise.
catch-22, we're hearing
Last
some.
longer.
It's a hot mic.
But that catch-22 is so real because we're all caught up in that. And so I think that one of the ways for us to get around that is to get people to talk about us, be very intentional about getting people to boast about you, because I remember that struggle. I'm the first person of color to ever represent this district. So talk about, they've never seen anyone like me. I represent a mostly white district. So I had people talking about my work in different circles, and with the seniors, they talked about how I helped seniors with a lot of domestic violence issues, or scams and other ways to connect with them. So it's not coming from me, and I found that to be very helpful. And social media helps too, because when people amplify your messages, that is really helpful. And so some of these things are things that women should think about in coming in, how to build that network of skill sets of people. In order to build you up so that you appear qualified to the constituents that you're going to serve. And nothing beats having one-to-one conversations. And I think that was how I won my first race. I spent a lot of time in the district. In fact, I door knocked my district twice before the Get Out the Vote weekend. And those conversations really helped me to connect with my constituents. And actually, I have a funny story. When it was the summer of 2018, I was door knocking, and it was like, I was 31 at the time, younger. But I looked even younger when I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans and going up to knock on the door. And this is one older woman. She was like, "Are you here to sell Girl Scout cookies?" Like, I'm an attorney. I'm going to tell you about all the work that I'm doing. But it just reminded me of just this image of what they have in their minds and how she ended up being a very strong supporter. She has my sign out every single year now, but it took having that conversation to tell her about my qualifications. And so I don't feel so badly about boasting, because I think people need to know. How else would they know otherwise, right? And some of the ways for us to build these foundations that are so necessary to have a successful campaign is to take some of these classes that are offered, whether that's Emerge Mass, training Democratic women, or the Democratic Party also has training. There are many other, some bipartisan training as well. I know at Harvard, they have the women and policy training as well. And so there are many ways for women to look at what's ahead so that we can plan ahead. And to see, even understand the nuts and bolts. And I think another important factor is family support. I would not have been successful without my family being there. I had to take time off, and I was very privileged to be able to take time off of work because my now husband is able to, pay the bills. But that's truly a privilege. But that's also a conversation of, we're going from a 2-income family to 1. What is that going to look like for us? And also my extended family, my parents, my sisters, it is all consuming, right? Because when you're running, it's not just you, you're putting your entire family and lives on the line in the public's eye. And I wanted to make sure that they understand what we're getting ourselves into. And so these are really early conversations that you should be having to see if your capacity, and also to build on that network, because you're going to have to turn to them. It gets lonely being a candidate when, there are days when you come home and you're like, everyone hates me. I don't know what I'm doing. And you need that network to lean on.
Yeah, incredibly true. Also, sometimes the network just shows up at your house with dinner after a long day, and that's really, really great.
Absolutely. My daughter was a lifesaver for me, because I just didn't have time. I wasn't cooking. I was living on pizza and potato chips.
Yeah.
In my campaign, pizza and potato chips. So my daughter would bring me plates. My daughter's all grown up, for folks who are wondering. She's all grown up, and she would come over and she would bring me plates. But that family support is so key.
It's huge. We are going to get to the positive and the progress. Representative, you mentioned the 30% that we're hitting, but I think it's important to be really candid about some of the challenges. So I do want to ask one more question that sort of sits in the negative, but for all the progress we've made, there's still a lot of BS out there, right? I think we can say a lot of double standards, a lot of work that we still have to do. Could I ask each of you to name one thing that just really ruffles your feathers, that makes you nuts, that you think we need to work on? And if you have a suggestion of how we work on it, I'd love to hear your prescription. Mayor, can I start with you?
I am going to defer. I am, because I can't narrow it down to one thing. That's one. And I'm still, I think, I'm still reflecting on all of the nonsense and noise that can get in the way of a good race, and more important, the work that you're trying to do. So I will certainly let someone else go first. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I'll continue to think about what that one thing is.
Well, jump in if you have a light bulb moment. Amanda, maybe you want to go first.
I think it's also hard to narrow it down to one thing. And I will just say quickly, because I know Mayor Janey, you made a really excellent point earlier about taking credit and how that can be used against women. And that's why in all of our research, we try to give very plain tips to women on how they can overcome bias and overcome some of these issues. And we tell women to really have a mix of taking credit and sharing credit. And just having to be conscious of that language is something that men don't have to worry about. But I think much more broadly, it's for us, it's the imagination barrier and the fact that there is still so much scrutiny on women's age, on their appearance. There's a lot of racial bias. There is a lot of internalized misogyny that even women, some people just assume that women voters are going to be easier on women. That is certainly not the case. And so until we can change the system and get more women and people of color elected, we have to work within the system that we have. And that's why we do this research, but we really challenge everybody as a human and as a voter when they hear their friends and family, or maybe somebody that's connected to politics, make a comment about a woman that they're pretty sure the person wouldn't make about a man, to just say politely, I'm just curious, would you say that about so-and-so if they did that, or would you say that about a man? Because I find that that does actually make some people think a little bit differently, at least for the moment, about the comments they're making about a woman's tone of voice or a woman showing ambition or any other manner of things that women are punished for.
I cannot agree more with you. In fact, just last week, I got an email from someone who told me to stop giving him a pageant girl answer. And this was after, yes, that was my face when I saw that email in writing. And that's exactly it. I actually wrote back and I said, I am always happy to have conversations with constituents, but when it comes to this, the sexism is blatant, and I'm not sure if this will be a productive conversation for us. So I think it's so key to call these things out, because we cannot continue to just deal with this double standard as though it's, business as usual. People need to understand that it's wrong, and that and sometimes that people just need to have someone point it out. They might not even understand that, how we could interpret that, and how that is a horrifying thing to say. And would you have said that to a man? And so with all of this, it's important to have conversations with folks, because the more they see and interact with women leaders, I hope it would be more comfortable for them, and that we can adjust some of these double standards. But I don't think this is anything that we're going to be able to change overnight. And it's going to take an intentional effort of everyone speaking up. And how we there's that phrase of not being a bystander, but to be an upstander for many things. We want to encourage people to be upstanders for all of these potentially sexist things that are said and done, even when we're not there, and they are there to correct some of these behaviors and words.
Yeah, I'll just add briefly. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Amanda.
Oh, well, I'll just add really briefly that we actually have research on calling out sexism that's really helpful. And we were really surprised that voters actually want to see women address it head on. And if women don't address it, voters will actually see that as weak potentially, and that can be harmful for women. So that was really interesting. We always thought the strong and silent approach was what people wanted, but that is not the case. So but go ahead, Mayor Janey.
Well, thank you. So I agree with everything that has been said. I am thinking back to some of my interactions with colleagues, so colleagues that have been elected, thinking about my interactions with constituents. I actually had a constituent come into my office at City Hall in the City Council and tell me that I needed to be more subordinate. He literally used that word. Exactly. And so I think for me, when I think about cutting through the nonsense and noise, it's the double whammy of sexism and racism that I've had to encounter. And so people are thinking you're not enough, or, because you're a woman, but they're also thinking that because you're Black. And so it's difficult to kind of cut through that. But I think the more and more that people see folks running and winning their races and kind of changing that narrative, the more progress we'll continue to make, because then we're changing what the normal is. It goes back to that, if you can see it, you can be it. And so, I think about not just the little girls, because people would always say, oh, little girls need to see, but guess what? Little boys need to see as well. All children need to see women in leadership. And so for me, I think it was racism and sexism and the double whammy, the intersection of those two.
And I would add sometimes some grown children need to see it. Yeah,
absolutely.
I can't help but share one of my own stories quickly. I was a few weeks into being 26 years old at a candidates night running for select board in Brookline. There were 5 of us running for 2 open seats. Almost everyone else on the panel was older and married. You were not allowed to address questions to just one person, but an older woman got up and addressed a question just to me and said, how do we know you won't get married and have kids and leave Brookline? And I'm looking around and thinking, well, this person over here is married and has kids, and this person over here and this person over here, you don't have a problem with them. And so I just looked at them and said, oh, so-and-so, I'll leave their name out. Oh, so-and-so, did my mother send you with that question about when I'm getting married and have kids? I was so stumped in the moment. My only thought was to try and be funny and deflect, but sometimes you're just so shocked by the blatant, in that case, ageism and sexism, that you don't quite know what to do. So, well, I promised we'd turn to the positive, and we're going to do that. So, we have 2 history makers here. Amanda, you have been in the thick of this for years. We are clearly in a remarkable moment in Massachusetts politics. I think back to that press conference now 2 or 3 weeks ago, where folks were on the steps of the State House talking about the assault on abortion rights. And if you looked, the leadership was all women. It was remarkable. And 10, 20 years ago, we were scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of women in leadership positions in Massachusetts government. And now we're at the forefront. I'm curious to hear from you how you think we got here, and particularly for Representative Nguyen and Mayor Janey, what your experience has been running and serving in this incredible moment of transition. How have you felt it? How has it been for you as a human and also politically?
I'll just jump in. I think you can feel it. It's tangible. There is an energy that is infectious. It's inspiring. And so to be working alongside so many incredible women, there was a sisterhood there. In fact, I'm sure you've heard me say, I'm sure you've heard lots of women in elective office describe another woman as a sister in service. And so that sisterhood is real. We, in many ways, encourage each other. We're experiencing things that many of our male colleagues just don't understand. And so to have that place, that safe place where you can go, and it's not to say that there isn't drama or issues among women, but for the most part, my experience has been the strong, beautiful sisterhood. I remember serving as mayor in 2021 at a time where more and more Black women were leading American cities, which was just incredible to see. So I think this is a sign of what's to come. The topic here is the future is female. And so I would say we're just getting started. What you saw on the State House steps, that's just the icing on the cake. There's so much more to do in terms of getting that state legislature beyond the 30%, and getting other executives in terms of the municipalities in the Commonwealth to be led by women, and more people of color. But I'm excited about what it means for us now in this moment and what it means for our future.
I completely agree. You definitely, the excitement is palpable for sure. I mean, we women won 5 out of the 6 statewide offices. And after the redistricting, we brought in so many more diverse candidates into the legislature. And I'm excited to see it continue to grow. We're hovering at the 30%, but I'm confident that if we continue to build that pipeline, particularly just getting people to start getting on that ladder of engagement, getting on to local school committees or select boards or or just even getting involved with campaigns. That was how I got excited about running. I was volunteering for Senator Lydia Edwards because we were legal services attorneys. And I remember just seeing that excitement that gave me the campaign bug. And so I think that not only should we concentrate on recruiting candidates, we also need to recruit more women and people of color into campaigns, because the campaign looks very different when you have diverse voices at the table. There is no playbook for people who look like us because we're not the traditional candidate. And so let's create our own playbook that way by bringing more people in. And so I think there is a lot of that now. There's I've seen an increase in candidates training and campaign staff training, and that's what we need to continue to build on and be very intentional about where we recruit as well. Going back to my earlier point about people not being asked, that is a huge problem. And so how can we find the people, ask them, and give them the support in order for them to be successful? And another thing I want to note too is it's not just about getting us into office, it's also about supporting us while we're in office so we can move up in leadership. There is also, just like with any other company, any organization, you see as you move up the ladder of your responsibilities and leadership, you'll see that it's a negative correlation with diversity, which is a big problem. So how do we do that? How do we work with one another to support one another, to help each other move up? And that support at the local and state level is so important because that's how you build that pipeline to go into the higher offices at the federal level. We're constantly lamenting the lack of diversity in the federal government. It's because we don't have that infrastructure and pipeline to feed into those positions.
So Amanda, I'm going to guess there was a big cheer going up in the Barbara Lee family office on election night. How did we get here? I'm going to guess not an overnight success.
Definitely not an overnight success. And I think that there's a reason that my boss, Barbara, called Massachusetts the original old boys club for so many years. And she wouldn't say this, but I do have to give her personally credit for a lot of this too, because she's been fighting for this for more than 25 years. And when she started, a lot of people said she was crazy. And now they're, of course, realizing that she was right. But what I think that especially Mayor Janey and Representative Nguyen, and I often talked about this during the campaign, Mayor Janey, that back when Barbara started, women were really running, trying to fit into an outdated template that was built for men. They were not talking about their personal experiences as much. They were even wearing clothes that were more masculine because they were told to dress for success and posing in front of mahogany desks. And both Mayor Janey and Representative Nguyen really ran as what we call 360-degree leaders. They brought the entirety of their lived experience to the conversation. And what we found in our research is that really resonates with voters because voters tend to believe that women are more in touch with their lives. And in a recent poll we did, women voters said that they believe women leaders are better equipped to solve the problems that they, the voters, face and the country faces because women are facing them together. And so by fearlessly bringing up issues that women have faced in their life, and we've seen in the past 5 years, women candidates have commercials talking about family struggles with mental health and addiction and housing insecurity and things that decades ago, probably male consultants would have urged women to keep quiet. Women are proactively talking about, and voters are responding to that very positively. And I think that's one of the most exciting trends that we've seen, having more women in leadership, because with that press conference last week, the seeing women talking about reproductive freedom is very different because women have a direct stake in that conversation. And I think that that is a change that we've seen, having so many women leaders with so many issues that tend to impact women.
Well, before we transition to taking questions from our audience that is already coming in, let me close this portion of the program by asking each of you to give our audience members who you have undoubtedly convinced to run for office a piece of advice, something you wish you had known before you jumped into the trenches. Representative Nguyen, can we start with you?
Absolutely. Carve out time for yourself. Campaigns are all consuming. And I really regretted not being very firm about, take one evening off just for yourself, or your family, or whatever it is that makes you happy, because that will help you sustain the stress of the campaign. And even now in elected office, I do the same thing. Sundays are just non-negotiable. That's my only day with my family. And I think that that will help me stay in this for the long run. And so I hope that people will consider that.
Mayor.
Along the same lines, I would say self-care. And so that is something that I have tried to focus on. I certainly was not as successful in that space early on. I remember at the end of my first term, I hosted an event free of charge for my sisters in service, particularly women of color who were elected, but I did include the 2 new Boston City councilors who were women, who were not women of color because they were new and I wanted to bring them into the fold. I did a whole self-care spa day. Come in, you know, so all the electeds come in and just take care of yourself, because I recognize at the end of that term, what a toll this takes on you in terms of your psyche, your mental health, on your family. You constantly, I mean, you'll have folks who will appreciate your work, and occasionally you'll even get a letter of appreciation. And whenever I did, I would put it up on the wall for my team to see, because 9 times out of 10, the communications we're getting is some problem that we need to solve, or something that a constituent doesn't think that you're doing enough on. And so when we would get that positive feedback, we would put it up. The second piece of advice, in addition to the self-care, is the engagement with folks. The campaign is just the first phase of it. You need all of these folks who support your campaign, who vote for you, who volunteer, who knock on doors, who give you money. You need them when you govern. You need them when you legislate. You need to have relationships with folks still, because that's how you get the work done. And so I would encourage folks to keep those relationships and make sure that they are transferring those relationships into their space in elected office as well.
Excellent advice. Amanda, I don't know how you're going to top those 2 tidbits, but what do you have for us?
I have a couple of quick tips from our governor's research, sort of along the lines of what Representative Nguyen was saying. We recommend that candidates have a very frank and clear conversation with their family before they decide to run, to get a sense of how much everyone in the family wants to or doesn't want to be involved in the campaign, so that there are clear expectations going in, especially for people who have children or may want to feature extended family in commercials and things. There may be a family member who's not comfortable. And so laying out those boundaries ahead of time is really helpful. We've also found that we recommend that candidates hire the most diverse staff that they can, because the more diverse staff people have in place, the more successful the campaigns tend to be. And my boss, Barbara, always asks women, what are they doing? Resilience is so important to her. What are they doing to care for themselves? And so we always recommend that people carve out time, whether it's a workout in the morning or going to coach a loved one's basketball team or going to a softball game for a kid, whatever is going to bring you joy, taking that time, because we find for women, there's just so much more negativity flying, whether it's on social media or elsewhere. And so having that time to regroup, and also having a person outside of politics that you love and trust that you can call and maybe cry or express whatever you're going through, and have that person support you, I've also heard is really helpful for all leaders.
Fantastic. Well, we have a bunch of questions in the chat. We're going to do our best to get to all of them. Folks who are watching, if you do have a question you haven't asked yet, please drop it in the chat. We are going to hopefully get to all of them. A quick question that is for Representative Nguyen. The bill that we mentioned earlier around childcare, the questioner is asking, it's been filed a few times, it hasn't passed yet. Why do you think it hasn't moved, and what's the likelihood that it passes this time?
It is very difficult, as you know, when working in legislation, it's very difficult to gauge, especially because bills have just been filed a couple months ago. Many of them still need to have hearings. There are changes in terms of the makeup of, what committee, who's chairing what committee. And so I can't give a definitive answer as to, the timeline of when or whether it would even pass, but what I can tell you is that there is great excitement because many of the caucuses have put this as a priority. We are hearing from many organizations out there. And in fact, we want to hear from you. So if you really care about this bill, you can submit testimony. You can testify at the hearing when that hearing comes up. That's how you can get engaged. That's how we can build the political capital in order to push this bill forward. And so we want your help to make this a reality. If you need to get some guidance on how to submit testimony or anything like that, feel free to reach out to my office. I can put it in the chat. I don't know if people can see it, but you can look me up on the legislature's website, which has all my contact information. But we do welcome your support as we work to get this through.
Great. The next question is for everyone. One of our viewers is asking, I'm curious how you dealt with the emotional barriers to running. How did you convince and remind yourselves that you're qualified? How did you hold on to that in the face of the inevitable criticism of being a woman in the spotlight? I know we say to, quote, pretend you have the confidence of a mediocre white man, but that's not always easy.
I'll jump in.
Spoken. Yeah.
It's very difficult. It is very, very difficult. It is nonstop. You could get it from colleagues who are elected. You can get it from other candidates in a race. You can get it from the media, from constituents. It's just nonstop. So it's really important, again, back to that self-care, to carve out that time, but also surrounding yourself with people who build you up. Folks are hell-bent on tearing people down. You need people who are going to build you up and stand with you. So important to surround yourself with those folks. I remember folks used to say to me all the time that I had to develop thick skin. And I understand where they were coming from with that, but my approach was more around oily skin, because I didn't want to get to the point where I'd be so hard, a hard shell, that I was just hardened in my approach and then you couldn't penetrate. I wanted that negativity, the noise, the nonsense to just roll off my shoulder. And so rather than harden up, I think of it more as the need to kind of have moisturized, oily skin where some of that negativity just rolls off your back.
I love that. I'm going to use that going forward.
Feel
You're
free.
right. I do not want to have hardened skin. I want to build on your point about surrounding yourself with good people. I actually found it to be helpful to also surround yourself with people not in that political world. That is so helpful. So I have friends, like girlfriends that I go to brunch with, who I just don't want to talk about politics. I just want to hang out with you and talk about whatever it is we saw on TV or clothes or whatever else. And that's how we can stay human. That's how we can kind of, ease off this emotional part of this job. Because if you're on 24/7, that is just not sustainable.
It's absolutely
Yeah.
right. Amanda.
Well, I think that we also like to remind women that so much of what they're facing is systemic, because I think women just internalize a lot of things and tend to blame themselves. And when we're able to show that statistically, the fact that it takes women longer to raise money, and even more so for women of color, for example, that hopefully will help take the burden off of women, because we find that a lot of women just tend to blame themselves or think that they're the only ones that are facing some of these challenges, and that is not the case. So I also love the oily skin metaphor, because it is, to the extent that it's possible to not take things personally, is so important, but that's a lot easier said than done.
I will say that years ago, I had a very challenging conversation with a voter who frankly told me what they thought of me. It was not a warm and fuzzy conversation. And I was in my 20s, and it left me, thankfully not in front of the voter, but ultimately left me in tears. And I looked at myself in the mirror, literally, and decided then and there that there was going to be a bullseye of people whose opinion of me could keep me up at night. If you were in the center of that bullseye, if you're my family, my closest friends, the people who really know me, and you pull me aside and say, hey, Jesse, that vote you took, that position you took, the way you're doing that thing doesn't feel right, that will cause me to reassess, to really rethink about myself. That doesn't mean if you're further out in the bullseye, I don't take your feedback. I don't stop and consider whether or not, oh, you have a good point. I could think about this differently. There might be something I'm not considering. But whether or not you get to me, if you cause me to lay awake at night, if you cause me to question myself as a person, you have to be in that center. Now, I'm a human being and sometimes I absolutely fail at this. Let me be clear. But that's the line I tried to draw in the sand. It doesn't always work, but it's been helpful for me for a long time. Let's get to a different type of question. We have a question here that I think is very smart and thoughtful. How do we talk about the need for more women in office and the very real empowerment that comes with sisterhood and sentiments like the future is female, while also holding space for our non-binary, genderqueer, etc. siblings whose voices we also need to hear more of and who also need our support? So important, especially given the attacks that we're seeing around the country now. Who wants to jump in first?
I think we've started talking about this earlier. And when we're talking about diverse voices, we're not just talking about women. We're not just talking about people of color either. Genuinely diverse voices have to have these different lived experiences. And that includes our friends and family members who are LGBTQ plus. And so we need to continue to support them and encourage them to consider running for office as well and contribute to the policies that will impact them. And so that engagement is across the board. Diverse voices will lead to more innovative changes, period. And diversity can come from so many different areas.
I agree. I don't even think there's anything to add other than the need to continue to support candidates in this space, because they face even additional barriers when you start thinking of the intersection of race and gender and sexual identity and everything else. And so we have to be good allies in this space.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think it's, I can't say it any better than that. I totally agree.
Yeah, and also to the point, I think, Amanda, you talked about hiring a diverse team. That also means in gender identity and the entire.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we can add to that abilities as well, you know,
Yeah.
like different abilities. So
100%.
this is a conversation that's so much broader.
We have another question. How do you deal with people sexualizing women as a way to criticize and diminish their success? It's a tough question.
I think what we point out in our research a lot is this is a common attack on women. And the reason that it's effective is because of something that we call the ethical pedestal, that voters tend to believe that women are more trustworthy and more moral than men. I think this may have roots in the suffrage movement, where women argued if they were allowed to vote, they would clean up politics. And the problem with that is once women are accused of immorality or wrongdoing and they're knocked down from the pedestal, it is a lot harder to climb back up. And any attack on a woman's ethics or morals is known to be effective, especially early in a campaign cycle. And so those types of whisper campaigns or loud whisper campaigns or saying things out loud are a direct attack on a woman's morality. Another attack that's kind of in a different but similar vein is she's mean, she's a bad boss, she takes advantage of the system, she's dishonest. All of these things chip away at that ethical pedestal, and it can be very damaging for women. So I think calling these things out, addressing them head on, if it is sexism, calling that out, and also working with validators to talk publicly about why this is more broadly problematic, we found is also effective, because saying something about one leader, you know, making some kind of sexual innuendos is disgusting, but that actually has an impact on all women and everyone that has to hear this, and stereotypes. And so it's important to kind of reiterate the broader effects of these attacks as well.
Mayor, Representative, either one of you want to jump in?
I think Amanda said it all. The only way to deal with it is to call it out. We just can't sit back and be silent, and have those allies be ready and to answer. I mean, especially nowadays with social media, we can't keep track of everyone who's talking about us on every platform. And so to build out that network and also to help each other out. I mean, if we start seeing that as elected officials, as leaders, we do have responsibility as well to help call that out.
And I think we've all seen this in campaigns where women who may be running against each other will band together. If one of them has faced a particularly brutal example of sexism, you know, they'll jump in and say, absolutely not. She is my opponent in this race, but what has happened to her is unacceptable. And I think, you know, Representative, that's exactly the type of thing you're talking about. Another question: what happens if you run and lose, especially if you're still interested in being in public life? Is there a path back?
Well, our research says yes. So that's good. And we found that voters say they will not hold it against a woman if she's lost an election. And it's also important to point out that every president after Abraham Lincoln and before Donald Trump, and including our current president, has lost at least one major election and then still went on to be president of the United States. So we studied campaign loss because Barbara felt like women had often been blamed and shamed for losing elections. And for men, it was actually seen as a prerequisite for a successful career in politics. And we were pleased to find that that was not the case with voters anymore, that voters will be open to voting for a woman if they run again. What the difference is voters have a lot of opinions on what women should do after an election. And that gets back into a lot of the economic issues. If women take off a couple of years to campaign, they may need to take a job to support their family. But ultimately, voters just want to see women stay rooted in the issues they focused on during the campaign. So whether it's joining some boards or starting a foundation, working with your opponent, or holding your opponent accountable, continuing to stay part of the conversation is important. And I know Barbara feels very strongly that women should absolutely run again. Kind of looking at you, Mayor Janey, but no, just generally. And there's a really great story about one of our heroes, Bella Abzug, after she lost an election and had a Washington Post reporter in her apartment, and she was kind of yelling at him. And you can picture this if you've seen Bella Abzug saying, "I will not let you write my political obituary." How come when a man loses an election, he's given time for a suntan and a shave and sent back out there, and women are sent back to the kitchen? And I think we really have to challenge those stereotypes.
Amen.
I think it's just to your point about we can't let someone else define our narrative. It's our own narrative that we need to be proactive about. And also, when I ran, I was fully ready to lose. I was completely the underdog. That was my first race. They did a poll, I think, around primary where I had a 30% chance of winning, and I still kept going. And I say this because I think there's value in running, period, because you are showing people that there is a real choice. And in my situation, I wanted to make it very clear that there were people in this district who cared about reproductive rights, who cared about climate change, who cared about common sense gun safety. Many of these issues need to be discussed and be brought up. And that was why I ran. So I ran fully expecting to lose. But I'm very thankful that now I'm in office. But one of the things to remember too is that you learn so much from just running, whether you win or lose. When after reflecting back on my first campaign, I learned so much about myself. I learned so much about others. I learned so much about policy that I just had never thought of or heard of because of all the conversations with constituents. And so even if I had lost, I would have made out very well because I gained a whole new set of skills, a whole new understanding of myself, my capabilities, the way to connect with people. And those are skill sets that you can use for the rest of your life.
So I'll just say this, Amanda, I'm not sure what the future holds in terms of future races, but what has been important for me is to stay focused on the work. It's what I have been doing my entire career. And so I remember an earlier comment, someone talked about the local races that women tend to run for. Perhaps that's in part due to a barrier to higher office, but I think it's also in part because that's where you can touch people. That's where an issue that is impacting your neighbor, that's where you can make a difference on that. And so, you know, whether it's elected office, whether it's the nonprofit space, I want to stay focused on the work as a problem solver, like so many other women in this space. And if I'm ready to go again, Amanda, you'll be the first one. How about that?
Well, and I think Representative, when you made such a good point too, that there's so much value in running. And I think one place where women make such a difference is in influencing the conversation on a campaign. And I think certainly Jessie did that in her last campaign, that if women are not running and bringing issues to a forefront, bringing them up at debates, talking to constituents about them, then they're not going to get the same attention that if it were only men in the race or, you know, different people in the race. And there's so much value in that too, in serving the community in a different way.
And Amanda, is it safe to say that we would not have Governor Healy without candidate Shannon O'Brien, without candidate Martha Coakley, without all of these women who ran and lost and set the stage and normalized over years and years and years before we got to where we are?
Absolutely. And Evelyn Murphy, and I mean, we talk a lot at the foundation just about the way that Jane Swift was treated and how unfair that was, but there were definitely so many women that helped blaze the trail to get us to where we are now.
Well, I know we have a few questions left, but we are so close to time. I think that is going to have to be it. Amanda Hunter, Representative Nguyen, Mayor Janey, Phyllis Rappaport, and the entire Rappaport Foundation, thank you so much for an incredible conversation. Thank you to everyone who is watching. And I am going to take the liberty on behalf of our panelists, and I'm going to guess on behalf of the Rappaport Foundation, you have been officially asked to run for office. If you're sitting here listening to us talk about how you need to be asked over and over and over again before you decide to jump, consider this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 people asking you to go out there and run at the level that works for you in your community. We're delighted to have so many people interested in this important topic. Thank you again to our incredible panel and to all of you for joining. Have a great rest of the day.